in southern Ellis County, and we came out here to talk with Dr. Dwayne Elmore, our wildlife extension specialist, about the soil and the ecology that we're finding in western Oklahoma. And just in this small area, there's a lot of range. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, one of the things I think is so interesting about Oklahoma is how diverse the state is in plant composition as you move from east to west. And that's driven by climate and soils primarily. And even in a small area like here where we're at in Ellis County, you can see tremendous variation. We're standing in a moderately sandy site here, and we have lots of sand sagebrush, Artemisia filifolia, which grows in sands. But if you get into some of these tighter soils, you'll start to pick up mesquite, which is in our background, and it just transitions tremendously, even going on the north side of the river versus the south side of the river.
So you were talking about the sand. We've got a little bit here. It's kind of a sandy soil, but let's talk more about it as far as what we're going to see in some of the other.
Yeah, so we're going to go to where shinnery oak grows soon, and that'll be a really coarse sand. It'll look very different, and the plant community, plant composition will be totally different. You'll have some overlap, but instead of being dominated by the sand sagebrush and patches of mesquite, we'll be in this clonal low-growing oak.
Okay, so does this retain a little bit more moisture for these plants here versus the thicker granular sand?
Yeah, you'll often have more moisture in the immediate surface, but even those deep sands, if you dig down 6, 8, 10 inches, there's an amazing amount of subsurface moisture. And those plants, the sagebrush and particularly the shinnery, they have extremely deep root systems where they're able to tap into those reserves during periods of drought out in western Oklahoma.
Okay, and we have the Artemisia behind us here. It's a beautiful silvery plant like our Artemisia that we find a lot of times in our garden, but a little bit different. Can you tell us about this plant? So
this is a little unique amongst Artemisia because a lot of them do not resprout if they're top killed, but this particular one does, so it's very fire adapted. And it would have to be to exist in this landscape, which is very fire prone. So this plant, actually you wouldn't know it, but it was burned less than 3 years ago. So this is less than 3 years growth following a prescribed fire. And so it's readily adapted to fire, has a beautiful, delicate structure, and there's a lot of wildlife species that rely on it. We're hearing casting sparrows all around us, which is a shrub obligate sparrow that really use this plant for nesting.
Okay, and then behind us we have a clump of a plant that I kind of recognize. We use it in the landscape a lot, actually. This is sumac.
Yeah, aromatic sumac, and it's a clonal. It'll form these small isolated clumps that are usually a couple of yards or maybe 20 yards across. It's dense foliage, provides a lot of shade. So again, there's certain wildlife that really rely on it. Bobwhite quail really use this plant during the summer for shading when it's real hot. And of course it produces a fruit that lots of species use for food during the fall.
Well, let's go find some of those other plants and some of the other soils that you mentioned.
Okay.
So Dwayne, we're just a couple of miles away from that last location, and I mean, it's hard to walk in this sandy soil already. Yeah. Can you tell us about what we're seeing different here because of the soil? So
these are very deep sands, and while we think of soil often having different distinct horizons, like an organic layer, an A horizon, a B horizon, there's not a lot of structure here. It's just kind of deep sands for many, many feet deep, in some places maybe 30 feet deep. And on these deep sands, we get into this shinnery oak plant community, which is really unique for western Oklahoma. It's a clonal oak, and some of these clones can be quite large.
So let's walk into the forest, shall we? I mean, it's hard to believe that this is is this one plant or several plants that we're looking at? But this is an oak tree.
It is an oak tree. We're probably walking through multiple plants, but some of these individual plants might be many acres in size, but they're just, the roots are mixed underground. And so we're probably standing in the middle of multiple plants, but this one plant might actually stretch out of sight here. So they can be quite large, tens of thousands of stems per plant, and some of them might only have 2 or 3 stems per plant. But each one of these individual stems is not a unique plant. They're connected underground.
Okay, so what we're seeing coming up as new growth is likely vegetative growth from a previous plant.
Yeah, and like the sand sagebrush we saw, this plant is very fire adapted. In fact, this site was burned just a couple of years prior. This is all regrowth. Has a massive root system. Almost all the biomass of this plant is underground, which is really important. That's how it survives fire. It's how it survives frequent drought. And it's also why these really deep sands are stable. They're not blowing. So if someone was coming here and spray this plant out or plow it out, you can expect soil movement and big blowouts. Because
you're going to lose all that root matter that's stabilizing that soil.
Exactly.
And we do have some grasses mixed in here a little bit.
You bet.
Tell us about the wildlife and the role that this serves with the wildlife and ecology.
So this plant produces a lot of acorns, at least in some years. That's important for wildlife food. There's a lot of birds that nest in the structure of this plant. You know, deer use it for fawning cover. Quail use it for cover throughout the year. It provides thermal cover in the summer and structure to protect them from raptors during the winter. It also provides shade and a micro refuge from high solar radiation that allows other plants to exist on this landscape. So, it's kind of a keystone plant in this deep sandy soil in western Oklahoma.
Because when you dig into the exposed sand back there, the temperature is quite a bit higher than it is underneath a little bit of shade.
Yeah, you're not going to want to walk barefoot through that. It's hot.
So we also have some oak trees behind us that look a little more like a true oak tree. Yeah. Can you tell us about the difference and what we're seeing behind us?
Sure. So oak, the genus Quercus, is kind of there's a lot of hybridization that goes on. You know, that's real common in oaks. And what these are thought to be are predominantly post oak and shinnery oak hybrids.
Okay.
There are some post oaks on this landscape. They're not that common around where we're at, but these plants have characteristics of both the shinnery and post oak, and they get quite large, and often you'll see them growing on these mounds, which are thought to be wind-blown sand deposits. And so they have a very different structure, and we'll see different types of wildlife use these taller oak plants than these shorter oak plants.
So we are in very western Oklahoma. Are post oaks typically around this part of the state?
Yeah.
How did the post oak hybrid get out here?
So you don't have to go too far east before you get into extensive stands of post oak, the next county or two over. But even in the draws, the more mesic sites in this county, you'll find post oak scattered about. So it's present.
How can we tell, based off of the leaf, the differences?
Well, there's a lot of variation in leaf structure, but in general, this leaf that's on my left is from these taller trees, and it has deep lobes, a more dark green color. It looks a little similar to post oak. Mm-hmm. But on the right, these leaves that are more grayish in color and have shallow lobes, this is the Harvardii, the shinnery oak. And so these hybrids, the taller ones, they're kind of intermediate between what a post oak would look like and a shinnery oak would look like.
Okay, so a true mix on the leaves and also the size. I mean, a little bit smaller than a traditional post oak, but definitely bigger than the shinnery oak.
Correct.
So you're doing some research with shinnery oaks. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so you know, we're standing near an area that was cultivated probably back in the 50s, and all of the shinnery was plowed out and later sprayed out. And so that didn't work so well for a lot of people that tried it, and they had big soil erosion, blowouts, and so that was subsequently put into perennial grass, an exotic perennial grass, to try to stabilize the soil. But on this particular property and other properties like it, there's interest of landowners to bring the native plant community back, not only for the soil holding capacity, but also for the wildlife benefits. And so if that's a goal, we don't really know much about the ecology of shinnery oak. So we're trying to learn, can we propagate it in a greenhouse? If we needed to produce 10,000 or 100,000 plants to revegetate an area, how do we do that? So for the past year and a half, that's what we've been trying to investigate. What's the best way to propagate this plant in mass so that a site could be revegetated.
And have you found anything yet from your research?
Yeah, so we've learned that we can do it both vegetatively by taking rhizomes, or we can also take acorns and germinate those. The acorns so far have proven the best as far as getting the highest survival. We've found that by cold stratifying those acorns, we get a much higher germination rate, and by not having any shade over those seedlings, we have much higher survival, which is typical with a lot of oaks, that they need a lot of sunlight during the early years of their growth.
All right, so one last question about shinnery oaks. What's kind of their range? I mean, we're in western Oklahoma. How far do they go?
All the way into New Mexico. We've got research going on actually near Roswell, New Mexico, and there's a lot of shinnery in that country. So it's basically eastern New Mexico, historically across the panhandle of Texas, and into western Oklahoma.
All right, well, thank you for sharing this with us.
You bet.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.